there. If you are just joining us, I'm Lauren Van Hamer from RDU on Stage, and I'm here with Nate. I got it wrong the last time. I'm going to get it right this time. McGeha.
Very close, McGaha, but yes.
All right. By our third time around, I will have it down. Who is the executive director of Arts North Carolina, which is our state's advocacy organization for the arts. And a lot has happened since we spoke last in May. And if you do have any questions, I do want to say if you have any questions for Nate, we'll monitor them in the chat and we will try to get to them. But when we did speak back in May, Nate, and that was just a few months after the shutdown. And at that time, it was estimated that the loss to the arts community due to COVID was going to be like to the tune of $32 million. And you estimated it was going to be double that because of the number of responses the impact survey had at that time. So what's the most current data statewide? Because at that time we were only 3 months in. Now we're almost a year in.
All right. Yeah, I'm a sucker for slides, so I'm gonna share this because it might help to explain.
You and Governor Cuomo, see, you guys are like the most popular people on the planet with your slides.
Let's see. Actually, I threw this in the middle of this slide in the middle of another slide presentation, so we can back up a little bit and.
We're going to go back to the Save Our Stages because I really do want to talk a lot about that as well.
So the last time I looked at the survey data, to answer your question more specifically, we're closing in on $90 million in reported losses, and I think that that number is weak, or is low, for a couple reasons. One of which is that the number has ticked up slower and slower, and I think that there's just a reporting fatigue, right? Like we all have answered those surveys about how bad is it over and over and over again. So when you cancel one more show, you just don't feel like going back to that survey. The other reason that I feel like it's probably double or more than that $90 million number is that a few months ago, the Brookings Institute did a report on just looking at the months of April through July. And they were looking at the entire creative industry, both for-profit and nonprofit. Across a wide range of fields, not just performing and fine arts. But when you can see the entire creative industry took a $150 billion loss, which was a 9% drop in sales, and 31% loss on jobs during those first 3 months. In North Carolina, we saw similar numbers on the drop in sales and similar percentages on job loss. But when you look at what the national impact was on fine and performing arts sector, it was 3 times as much on sales, and the job losses were just astronomical, right? Like, so basically 1 out of every 2 jobs was gone. So if you take those numbers and just take that to what we know about the North Carolina arts sector, the nonprofit arts sector, it's $100 million in lost sales in just the 4 months, plus as much as 20,000 lost nonprofit fine and performing arts sector jobs. So that's 20,000 unemployed North Carolinians in the arts. So if you take that 4 months and kind of project that over to where we are now, I think we're easily at $200 to $250 million in lost sales statewide. And that's just the nonprofit sector. And that's not even counting the music halls and the dance halls. And I mean, there's a lot of for-profit arts that we don't think about as part of our sector, but that really is part of the performing arts as well.
Absolutely. And it's we're going to get to Save Our Stages because that's the most recent legislation. But the last time we spoke, only something like 21% of last time we spoke, 46% of our arts organizations did not think they would survive COVID. Now that number, according to the most recent survey I just saw earlier this evening, it's about 21%. Is that because you have more people that have answered the survey at this point, or is that because the arts are benefiting from some of the funding programs, financial assistance programs?
I think that, because back when we were looking at half of the entire sector wasn't sure that they were going to survive. That was back in April, May. Nobody knew whether or not they were going to survive. A lot of things happened that made some major impacts. PPP loans were extensively taken by the nonprofit sector. We are all waiting for those to be forgiven. But there's absolutely no reason to believe that they won't. And actually, in this relief bill that got signed into law right before the new year, that it actually, any loan under $150,000, like within the next month, it's going to be a one-page form with like 4 questions on it: name, rank, serial number, how much did you borrow, and it's forgiven. So so the Congress is really trying to expedite the forgiveness process. And so I think that gave people a footing. The other thing that happened is that people had a chance to plan, right? Like when all of a sudden, your entire earned revenue model is gone. Not to mention at that point, the stock market was in much more of a free fall or much more of an unknown, and that has bounced back, and that's helped to support donors, particularly major donors, to continue their giving. I just read a Times article the other day. I know for me personally, anecdotally, I haven't heard about a lot of drops in giving. I think Times said giving was down by 14% nationally, but I think regionally that might be different here and there. There obviously is some giving trends that are moving more towards hunger and homelessness for obvious reasons, and unemployed. But by and large, donors have stuck with the arts, and they've stepped up in some major ways. So that's been really helpful. And we planned, right? Like we had a chance to see the donors didn't go away. We had the PPP money. We figured out how we're going to do it. Unfortunately, that probably meant a lot of job losses and a lot of layoffs. Some organizations going more dormant. Some are trying to find ways to do whatever programming they can to stay engaged with their communities. So obviously, we're not in the midst of a art sector that's thriving. But I think that by and large, the organizations have said, okay, well, here's our plan, right? Here's how we're going to get through to the end of this year, or to the end of next quarter, through the next quarter. So that's brought back some sort of optimism about the survival, though I don't think anybody is looking for, 5 months from now, we're going to be exactly where we were pre-COVID. That we're still only partway through a very long road.
Well, and I think arts organizations too have figured out ways to um, imagine new revenue streams, virtual programs, virtual camps. I think many arts organizations that I've seen have pivoted. Some are doing in-person programs and things. So it's really interesting to watch the evolution from where we were when you and I first spoke to now. There is some hope. You said it before we went on air. We're kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully that's true. There's so much data, so much funding data coming out, and there's all of these different terms coming out. And so I'm hoping you can help us make sense of it. But rewinding back to September, the North Carolina General Assembly passed the coronavirus relief legislation, and that provided $9 million, $9.4 million in emergency aid to the arts. Those funds, so people understand, were distributed locally by the United Arts Council and had to be distributed by December 1st, from what I understand, correct?
December 31st. They had to be to the end, they had to be distributed. I think they were trying to get them out by December 31st so that they would have that according to the CARES Act, they had to be in the hands of the end user, spent by December 31st.
Okay, perfect. So that money is separate from the most recent funding which Congress passed. President Trump just signed. It's a $2.3 trillion spending bill, and it included $900 billion in pandemic relief. The way I understand this, I think a lot of people are familiar with Save Our Stages. A lot of people are familiar with PPP loans. And of course, the federal unemployment programs that we've been seeing, all of that is covered under this legislation.
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and to just to touch back quickly on the 9.4 million, that was actually something that the last time we spent, I was just having those initial conversations. Within the North Carolina General Assembly, we work very closely with a group that we helped to form, which is the Arts Caucus, the Arts and Arts Education Caucus. I worked with specifically leadership on the House side of the Arts Caucus, both Democrat and Republican, and we formed what was probably one of the first CARES Act money for the arts bills that got filed in the state legislature. So that was initially for $3 million back in May. We continued to work that legislation with some grassroots campaigns. Obviously, as the summer went on, the need grew as well. We were also doing, at the same time, I'll talk a little bit more about this, talking about Save Our Stages, having those conversations with Congress. And then things really kind of ramped back up in August on the conversation at the state level. And that's when we were able to see really some strong bipartisan support around that, what eventually became $9.4 million, much of which went out per capita to every county. So every county got a dollar amount that was based on the population of each county. And then many of the county arts councils did the distribution of that money. Obviously in Wake County, it was United Arts.
And originally, am I wrong? Originally in that bill, there were counties, or in one of the state funding pieces, Mecklenburg County and Wake County were excluded from the funding.
So in the end, Mecklenburg and Wake were excluded from the funding by the General Assembly. The first draft of the bill, so on Monday, I got word that there was going to be $10 million in the bill for all 100 counties. It was literally the text that was forwarded on to me. By Tuesday, I had heard that that the way the language was set up, it was tier 3 counties, which is an economic ranking. So the most successful, strongest economic counties with populations over 130,000 were going to be excluded from the funding, and it was down to 9.4 million. So that funding was not going to go to 11 counties. So we were able to make a lot of phone calls. I worked with my lobbyist, of course, which was very hard because nobody was allowed in the building other than the General Assembly. And we were able to talk to the right people and get those 11 counties narrowed down to just 2 counties. The reason that leadership, particularly Republican leadership at the General Assembly, held back on those 2 counties was that Mecklenburg and Wake each had received separate amounts of CARES Act dollars from directly from the federal government that they had to spend. Guilford had received some of that funding as well. So in the end, both Wake and Mecklenburg provided $1 million from their CARES Act. And I had worked with leaders in both of those counties, as well as Guilford County, that had some direct funding to help them sort of navigate the process with their counties. And then Charlotte, actually, because it was a city over 500,000, had received several $1 million as well. So they had several $1 million that they also chipped in. So so that was why those counties were excluded, but they were able to access CARES Act money for the arts. So all 100 counties did end up accessing the CARES Act money, but the legislature just held back from Wake and Mecklenburg.
Wonderful. And thank you for clarifying, but I want people to really understand like the ins and outs, and there's so much information coming out on the federal level, on the state level, on the county level. So I just want people to understand.
No, and when that came through, so I worked as a lighting designer and a director of operations for Charlotte Ballet for years, and I worked here in Wake County with Carolina Ballet. So all of my friends are in Charlotte and Wake. So when that legislation came through and it like basically neglected all of my friends in the industry, it was like, we got $9.4 million. And it's like, but I let everybody down. So, but in the end, I think it sort of settled in a good place. But yeah, it was a heart-wrenching few weeks in September.
And so fast forward to December, now we have this new legislation that was just signed on the federal level. Um, it includes what we've all come to know as the Save Our Stages Act, Save Our Stages Grant. We've seen the hashtag all over the place. So, and I think a lot of people, when they think of this Save Our Stages Act, they're thinking Broadway, these big theaters, big municipalities. How does this money trickle down to our local stages, our regional stages in our state?
Sure. All right, I'm going to go back to share my screen real quick. I think it probably is a little easier to get a sense of it to start with a little bit of history, because as I understand it, even Broadway theaters was not exactly where this conversation started. But to kind of back it up, I don't think you can talk about Save Our Stages really unless you're talking about NIVA, which is the National Independent Venue Association. And really that is an amazing success story of grassroots advocacy. That organization did not exist in February of 2020. After COVID hit, by the end of March, they were just starting to get together, and they mobilized a website. They came around that Save Our Stages idea, that hashtag that we have seen everywhere, starting in late March, all the way through right up until this week. And they very quickly found themselves supporting a piece of legislation that was called the Restart Act. You don't hear much about the Restart Act. Now it had a decent amount of, actually big amount of bipartisan support in Congress. The problem with the Restart Act was that it was basically did for all small business. And by small business, they mean under 500 employees. So that's some pretty big businesses by what we would consider a small business. But for all businesses under 500 employees, that this act would do what it's doing for the Save Our Stages, which is 45% of lost 2019 revenue. So it was a massively expensive bill, and as such, it had very little chance of actually moving through, even though it had some bipartisan support. But they supported and said, this is what we need, and they very effectively kind of came around this idea and said, this is a solution to the problem. In July, working with Senator Klobuchar, who many of you know ran for the Democratic nomination president, as well as Republican Senator Cornyn, they came around this bill, which was kind of the Restart Act, but specifically designed for independent live performance venues. And in their head, this was about music venues and dance halls, right? Like this was not, I think once Senator Schumer got involved, the Broadway, the idea of it supporting Broadway became much more prevalent. But initially this was, really thinking about these mom and pop locally owned venues, and that were devastated by the pandemic. And I think that this is one of the harder things, is that as I have conversations with folks in the nonprofit realm, and we'll talk a little bit more about the bill, but that there is it does lean with a little bit of favoritism for the for-profit industry, but that's because the for-profit industry has actually lost a considerably larger portion of their revenue, right? So they didn't have donors to turn to, they didn't have donations to keep up. They went from 100% of their revenue to 1 or 2% of their revenue, and they didn't have any kind of donor. Not to mention, it was much more difficult for a lot of, outside of PPP, for these for-profit ventures. There wasn't a $9.4 million grant happening in any state, including North Carolina, coming from the CARES Act for for-profit venues. Some states there were programs for for-profit businesses, but the nonprofits were able to access much more funds. When the bill first came out in July, it required 70% of all revenue to be from live events, which pretty much ruled out most performing arts nonprofit organizations, because most performing arts nonprofits have somewhere between 40 to 60% of their revenue coming from donations. So this would have excluded them. Arts North Carolina started working with basically the other state advocacy organizations across the country, as well as Americans for the Arts, who we work very closely with. Started talking with NEVA, some other national arts advocacy partners. And it became a conversation where we were working for a whole lot of things: the unemployment, the PPP, funding for the NEA. That was all still ongoing work. But then there was also this work of support for the Save Our Stages Act. Now that this was a very, a live bill and was starting to pick up some bipartisan support, it also really touched on a lot of the talking points that we brought forward already. The main thing was fixing that 70% of all revenue to find a way to expand that to include more nonprofits. Back in August, we were really excited. Senator Tillis signed on as a co-sponsor of the bill. As a matter of fact, I was talking with his staff just a few days before this bill made it onto the Senate floor, and this was like after the PPP second draw. Save Our Stages was his #2 priority. So it was something that he had heard from the nonprofit and for-profit sector enough from this state that he recognized that there was a real need. And I think there was a lot of that feeling across the Senate. Now in October, HEROES Act 2.0, they had done the first HEROES Act back in May, passed the House, went nowhere in the Senate. In late September, early October, they passed HEROES Act 2. It was basically a wish list for everything we wanted. It included $10 billion for Save Our Stages. It included the unemployment extensions we were looking for, the second round of PPP, a lot of other things that I won't go too into, but it was really like almost everything on our checklist was there. And it was 70% of earned revenue. So we made that dent, we made that change. So now a lot more nonprofits were included, but at that time it was still primarily venue operators and producers. So it'd be so there was that question of, is a symphony orchestra a producer? Is because it was obviously very geared towards venues and the music industry and maybe Broadway, but not really thinking about the nonprofit sector. So then by December, when that bill came out, it was $15 billion because they expanded the money, but they also expanded who was included, which was actually specifically putting in the wording for performing arts organizations, museums, and cinemas, but not like AMC and Regal cinemas. Like we're talking about your mom and pop independent cinemas. And what it's worded as in the bill is grants for shuttered venue operators. So that will probably be the title that the Small Business Administration rolls out. We're thinking that we're going to see that guidance come online probably either right before or right after MLK weekend on the 18th.
So just kind of circling back around to cinemas, I know people just love the Rialto. Are we talking about small cinemas like the Rialto that's included in this?
That is exactly what we're talking about. So I'll kind of dive in here, and I know everybody's kind of heard a lot about this, so I'll kind of move through it relatively quickly. But really, you need to be operating. You can't have started your organization after the pandemic. You have to have already been in business. Your gross earned revenue only has to have lost more than 25% in one single calendar quarter. So you can't just pick 12 weeks. You have to do an actual January through March, April through June, etc. Now, the one thing, and this is something that's really important, is that the wording within the bill says that an eligible entity that gets a Save Our Stages grant, cannot receive a PPP loan. Now, of course, that begs the question: if you get a PPP loan, then can you get a Save Our Stages grant? That's one of the things that we're waiting for that guideline to come out on. It seems pretty clear to me that the legislative intent is that no, you can't get a forgiven PPP loan and get a Save Our Stages grant, but we're waiting for the guidance to come out from SBA so we know for absolutely sure. And this is where we start.
Yeah, sure. Let me ask you a question. If you received a PPP loan prior to what's happening now, prior to this bill, are you still eligible for a Save Our Stages grant?
Yes, yes. So it's really just about that second draw of the PPP. So because I think basically almost every business that qualifies for Save Our Stages has already taken out a PPP, with the very few exceptions that are in education.
Okay.
So yeah, so you are not disqualified from this just because you got a PPP loan back in May.
Okay.
And they did make several efforts to try and keep it. They were trying to make sure that it was professional organizations, but also not corporate, right? So no organization that is traded, no business that's traded on the stock exchange can be used. You can't receive more than 10% of your gross revenue from the federal government. You have to you can't do porn is basically it's a very fancy language to say, no live sex acts. It can't be of an excessively sexual nature. That does not mean that if you do a production of Hair 4 years ago that you're disqualified. We're talking about really seedy stuff. And then this language that you can't be more than 2 of the following 3, which is operate in more than 1 country, operate in more than 10 states, or have more than 500 employees. So yes, there will be maybe some chains of venues that will qualify under that, but that really, those massive, AMC, Live Nation, Regal Cinemas, they're not going to fall under this.
Okay.
Now I know that, specifically to your audience, the live performance venue performing arts organizations and producers, really, this is kind of where most of our folks fall into. You do need to have 70% of your earned income, your earned revenue coming from tickets and admission charges or production fees, which we right now are considering rental revenue, right? So we don't know that for sure. We're waiting for that SBA guidance, but rental revenue probably counts in this as well. Concessions, merchandise, etc. You have to advertise your event. You can't, there has to be some kind of online or print media. It doesn't necessarily give you a bare minimum. You don't have to have print and online, but you have to be promoting it somehow in the world. You got to charge some kind of admission for folks to get in. And then this next one is where a lot of the community theaters very well may get tripped up, and that's that you have to fairly pay staff and performers. And so we're waiting to see exactly what that means. I know we've got a lot of community theaters that may not pay their artists, but they do pay, say, directors or designers or an executive director, an artistic director. And so, obviously that didn't all get ironed out in the bill. And so the Small Business Administration is going to be working that. So that's something we're keeping a very close eye on, is exactly how that gets interpreted. But they were trying to craft the bill so that it was professional venues at all. Like all of this was helping professional organizations. It does have to be pretty obvious that you have an audience area and a stage area. You have got to have at least 2 of those positions. It's sort of weird for me to see how someone in Washington is going to define what a professional theater is. But yeah, I mean, I guess if you've got somebody running, sound and a stage manager and someone selling tickets, it's a show, right? So, but they do require that you have some kind of mixing equipment, a PA system, and a lighting rig. There is a second option that I've only recently kind of been looking at, is that you can also have a venue that sells admission to an event 60 days in advance and pays the artist either a percentage or a contract or some other mutually beneficial arrangement. I think this is more specifically for those venues that may not necessarily have mixing equipment and a lighting rig, but that are running a professional engagement where the artist is taking a percentage of the box office. So that would be included too. But I'm not thinking that there's going to be a lot of nonprofit performing arts sort of scenarios in that. I could be wrong. The surprise for me was that museums got added into this, which I think is fantastic. Though there's 2 caveats on museums. So while all the other groups can be for-profit, nonprofit, or even government operated. Museums have to be what is called a relevant museum. And what part of being a relevant museum by federal statute is that you are a nonprofit. So the museums have to be nonprofits, and they have to meet the federal definition of a museum, which is that you are displaying items in an enclosed area for public and cultural and public good, basically. And you have to have an auditorium. You have to have something with real fixed seating. You can't just set up chairs. You have to have some kind of defined space that has regular scheduled programming. So there are a lot of museums that won't qualify for this. And I know of some museum operators that are really wishing that they had an auditorium in their space now, that they don't. But they're going to be able to access the second round of PPP. Talent agents are going to be taken care of in this. I don't think that a lot of folks necessarily thought about talent agents who take a percentage, right? Like their work just went poof overnight. So that's going to be really crucial for them. And then movie theaters, like we said, is going to be like the Rialto and those small independent theaters that are usually showing more independent films and things like that. That I will say, and this is kind of an ongoing theme. You can see down, we can talk about what equates to a full-time employee, but I think the most important thing about the calculations, and this is throughout that legislation, is that you're not being penalized. You don't have to count PPP money that you got as part of your revenue. As a matter of fact, if you're a for-profit business and you went to file your taxes, you don't need to count your PPP money as part of your revenue. Or if you got a grant that was CARES Act money, you don't have to count that as part of your revenue. So all of that 9.4 million, or the money that came through United Arts from the CARES Act, all that CARES Act money is not going to hurt you in your calculations for Save Our Stages.
People are going to have tons of questions about this. I know when the CARES Act funding was coming through, United Arts Council did many workshops on this. Is United Arts or the small business, well, not United Arts, but the Small Business Association, or is Arts NC going to be doing any kind of workshops as all of our theaters and museums and some movie theaters as they get into this to support our local organizations?
Sure. So I'm going to be doing my very best if we get, so there may be opportunity for another webinar to kind of to walk through the application process. And I'm going to be relying on some of my contacts and board members to go through the process to help me learn, because I don't have a theater company to apply with, right? So it's kind of funny. I learn from people calling me and complaining, or calling me and celebrating. But like I need to get that feedback so that I have some idea of what's going on and what's being accepted, because I'm going to be looking at the same SBA guidance that everybody else is. I'm also hopeful. I've had last time around, we partnered with Triangle Artworks.
Yes.
And they got somebody actually from the regional office of the Small Business Administration specifically to talk on a webinar for us about PPP now, and some NDIDL and some other grant programs. I'm not sure. Now, obviously, everybody in the Small Business Administration knew PPP and EIDL going through the pandemic. How many people at the Small Business Administrations are going to understand this grant program? That might be a little harder to ferret out, but I'm also going to be working with Americans for the Arts, and so we'll definitely make sure that we can find some resources to kind of walk people through the process.
How much money do you think will, well, okay, you're about to answer my next question. All right.
Well, so before we talk about how much money, so I think it's really important to remember that $15 billion is a whole lot of money, right? So when you think about, I think at the end of the first PPP round, like every single nonprofit arts organization in the entire country got like $8 billion of PPP money. So 15 billion for only like this is still a whole lot of money for a sector. So I think it's going to be able to stretch, but the reality is that we don't know. There is a priority structure, and it is geared more towards those for-profit organizations that I was talking about earlier that lost 90% or 70% of their gross revenue, right? So in the first 2 weeks, they're only going to award money to those organizations that have lost 90% of gross revenue, not just earned, but total gross revenue. So that would include your donations, and that's going to count out a lot of nonprofits. The next 2 weeks is going to be those with 70% losses. Exact same kind of thing, probably going to cut out most nonprofits out of that. There may be a few that have lost that much and their donations don't make it up. But this is really going to be for the for-profit. But there is in the law, you can only spend 80% of the funding in that first 28 days, which means that there has to be at least, I think it comes out to about $3.5 billion. And there's never been a $3.5 billion grant program for the arts. And probably most of the organizations that are left at that point are going to be nonprofits. So we're really hopeful that there's going to be that there's plenty of dollars in this program. And of course we're watching Georgia tonight to see what's the likelihood that there'll be more dollars that could go into this program. So after that initial 20 days, there'll be at least 20% of those dollars left. Through the entire period, 2 billion of it, at least 2 billion of it has to go to 50 full-time employees or less, right? So they did make sure that there was a carve out for those smaller organizations because they wanted to make sure that it didn't just get drained by the big guys, and no more than 5 affiliates. So as we, I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't work at the Small Business Administration. So I'm just a lighting designer who learned how to do contracts, and now I read legislation. But that is what I know. So I'm feeling very confident that there will be enough dollars left. Now, of course, the big question is how much do we get, right? So that initial grant will be the lesser of 45% of your gross earned revenue from 2019, which we think is going to include rentals as well as ticket sales, merchandise, etc., or $10 million, right? So for most of us, that's going to be 45% of our earned revenue. There are, if you weren't in operations on January 1st of 19, they're going to figure it out. They're going to take an average of your monthly and prorate it. So they're going to find that number and give you 45% of what that number would be. So if you happen to go into business on January 15th or February 28th or whatever of 2019, you're going to be taken care of. But this is going to be where it gets interesting and we're assuming that this is going to take place on April 1st, though we don't know this for sure, is that after this initial round of grants goes out, then they're going to come back and you're going to have the ability to apply for a supplemental grant. So if you can show that really the quarter that we're in now, from January to January 1 until March 31st, is that you have lost more than 30% of your total revenue compared to the same quarter in 2019, you're eligible for a second grant equal to half of your initial grant. So, that could be, so you're talking about, it could be easily 55-60% of your total 2019 earned revenue between the two grants, though your total of both the grants can't equal more than $10 million. So no single entity is going to get more than $10 million on the grants. So I know that, like, when I first saw this, my chin kind of hit the drawer and we're all like ready for it to happen. Now, just to kind of wrap up, and then I can certainly take questions, or we can talk a little bit more about this or other things. The grants have to be used by the end of this year for the initial grants. That supplemental grant, that additional grant, you got until June 30th of 2022 to use. Allowable expenses include basically everything that you could spend PPP money on, but you can also get ready to mount your next show, right? So you can spend it on advertising, you can spend it on travel, you can spend it on capital expenses. So that the hope is that we can use these dollars not only to survive, but to start to thrive as we come into September and October, and God willing, an audience that's ready to come back to our spaces. You cannot take this money and buy real estate. You can't make political contributions. You can't loan it out to other people. So you can't loan it out to your actors or loan it out to your staff. You have to use it as the entity. And just know that there's going to be a lot of paperwork requirements on this. Obviously, this is a large grant program. They're going to require you to keep your payroll records for the next 4 years, other records for 3 years. There's going to, you're going to feel audited. There's going to be reporting, so that there is going to be a certain weight on this. I will say, and it's not as much of a problem because the way the dollars got distributed in North Carolina, but for all the CARES Act money that came out in the first round, and that there were a lot of states that were in this mad scramble to get that spent before December 30th of 2020, that has now been extended out until the December 31st of 2021. So there's a little, so that additional dollars that some states, North Carolina, I think we have spent every dime of it. But for anybody that's wondering, or has friends in other states, if the state has not spent all of their CARES Act money, or the municipalities, they've got another year to do that. So there's more flexibility there.
It's a lot of information. I will put the link to Arts North Carolina's website as well, so people can continue to get up-to-date information. If you are just joining us, and throughout the slide presentation, a lot of people are popping on. So if you just joined us and you have any questions, put them in the chat, and I will, and we'll get to them. I want to bring this down to tangible levels for people. So when we talk about our for-profit theaters, we're talking about DPAC falls into that for-profit entity. You have the new Stephen Tanger Center, which hasn't actually opened yet, but it's a beautiful, it's going to open in Greensboro. It was supposed to open in March and then didn't because of COVID. Those are the types of facilities we're talking about. Nonprofits are more the North Carolina theaters, the Carolina Ballets, Symphony, which we're not sure is going to be there. There's all these gray areas, but
Right.
That's what we're talking about. So the first tier is going to be those for-profit entities.
Right. Yeah, so you'll see the for-profit venues will definitely be the first in line. Also, like the Lincoln Theater downtown, I think is that those are the venues that you might not think about how many music venues there are in the state of North Carolina, but they're not just in cities, right? Like there is a building somewhere where a band shows up and plays music in small towns all over this state and all over this country. And so I think we're going to see a lot of funding going there, which is great because those are obviously not corporate entities. But yes, DPAC is going to be a perfect example. Raleigh Memorial, Duke Energy Center, that complex, as I understand it, should be eligible for this as well. So they'll be able to recoup some of their losses as well.
It sounds like a lot of the, well, and not places like, it sounds like a lot of the people who are members of the NC Live Coalition that are gearing up to hopefully reopen at 100% capacity.
Right.
Those sound a lot of people who will be in the tiers of this program. Last time we spoke back in May, we've spoken a lot about the venues, the nonprofits, the for-profit businesses. But last time we spoke back in May, we talked a little bit about the artists, the theater makers, the workers who have been furloughed. Some have been, a lot have been let go and fired. And then those people working as freelancers, some of them have been out of work for almost a year now. None of this funding that we've talked about yet covers those individuals, but the unemployment assistance does, correct?
Right. Yes. So on the unemployment, the first thing that I want to say is I got to remember all my acronyms without my slide. The Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation, or the FPUC, is got reinstated. That was the $600 that ran out at the end of July. That is back for 11 weeks. Yes, even though Trump signed it late, what I'm understanding is that will be paid retroactively. So we will get 11 weeks for any weeks filed, any benefit weeks filed between January 1 and March 14th. So those 11 weeks will be paid. In addition to that program, we have been working for something called the Mixed Earner PUA, which that we recognize that there was a problem. Say if you were you worked at an accounting firm for 30 hours a week, but then 10 to 15 hour weeks you were a working actor and maybe made $6,000 or $10,000 or $12,000 a year. There was no way for you to claim all of your revenue. We didn't quite get the fix we wanted, but if you are somebody that has made more than $5,000 on 1099s like that on your last tax return, then you can get an additional $100 a week for the next 11 weeks. So it's not a lot, but it's something. And we're hoping that if we get that foot in the door, that gives us something to build and expand on, particularly seeing how things go in Georgia tonight and who's going to be running the show in the Senate. You can see where my mind is starting to drift off to.
Focus. There's no results yet.
No results yet. Okay. So then you get the federal pandemic unemployment emergency compensation, and or pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, PUC. And what that does is that extends. It used to add an additional 13 weeks onto state benefits. That's now been expanded by an additional 11 weeks, so now you're up to 24 weeks added onto state benefits. I will say that when I talk to my partners from across the country, they think I must be mistaken when I tell them that North Carolina only has 12 weeks of unemployment. Like, I think it's like almost every other state in the union has 26. There might be one or two that had 24 weeks of benefits. We currently have 12. So we have people that have run out of benefits, and these programs, like that program was initially designed for 26 weeks of unemployment and 13 weeks to get you to the end of the year. Whereas our folks in North Carolina, we were running out of it in September, October, et cetera. So that program gets an additional 11 weeks. I will say that on that, and also for the PUA, which is for the 1099 workers, you can file claims on it through the 14th. But if you have an open claim, you can, and additional weeks that you're eligible for, you can continue to collect that through April 4th. I think it's all weeks up to April 5th. So I think April 4th is that Sunday that it cuts off. So so there's some relief there. And like I said, they extended the PUA. We've been talking about the PUA as unemployment for 1099 and contract workers. It is also unemployment for people that have run out of all other benefits. So if you have run out of your state benefits and your PEUC benefits, and then your federal extended benefits, which is a whole nother program, and once all of that is dried up and you still are looking for unemployment, you can apply for PUA if you haven't run through your PUA weeks yet as well. So it's out there. It is not nearly enough. And that's something that we're going to be continuing that conversation at the federal level. I think that we're going to be having the conversation in the short term at the General Assembly and in the long term, both at the General Assembly and the federal, at the state and federal level, because one thing that this pandemic has thrown wide open is we need to rethink how unemployment works. We need to get it updated. We need to make it work for the way people work now, not the way people worked in 1965 and how they get paid and how that works. Honestly, that's the gig economy was created by jazz musicians and not by Uber, but that's going to finally drive this conversation. And it might be that as an independent contractor, you're paying into your state unemployment tax, but that's how we make the system work. So this is going to be part of our work moving forward. The last thing I will say about individual artists is, if you get paid by 1099, apply for a PPP loan, right? So just because you're on unemployment doesn't mean you are a small business. If you work for different companies as a contractor, then you, in the eyes of the SBA, at least in everything that I have read, you are a business and can apply for a PPP loan so that you could be receiving benefits and have that loan forgiven, so that you could be receiving a forgiven PPP loan coupled with your unemployment, and that might make those benefits last a little longer. So there's several options out there. I think that we saw a groundswell of support for individual artists in the early parts of the pandemic. There's still some programs that are trying to continue that work, though it becomes harder and harder as the months drone on to raise money for those things. But that support is there as well.
I do want to ask you about the venues. I mentioned the NC Live Coalition a little bit ago, and a lot of our larger venues, Coca Booth, Duke Energy Center, DPAC, the Tanger Center up in Greensboro, they're all part of this. Carolina Theater Live Coalition, which is trying to implement best practices for these larger venues to operate at 100% capacity. So and I've been on the Duke Energy, Raleigh Memorial's Duke Energy Center website for the performing arts. They have extensive protocols for their conventions, for their rentals, for the classrooms, and for every part of that building. So what are some of the guidelines and parameters you're seeing for venues reopening? What's it going to look like when we go back?
See, I mean, I think that you're going to see, as we move through the reopening process, it's going to feel like, like those classrooms, right? Like audiences are going to have to be spaced 6 feet apart. You might see pods being allowed, right? So you can have these little groups of folks that are in the same family unit separated out. So we've been seeing that. I think that the more and more data we're seeing, I know I've been looking a lot at the aerosol study that's been coming out, that was done by the National Federation of High Schools Academics. Basically, I mean, they're working on high school orchestras and high school bands, but they're also college orchestras, college bands, and all of a clarinet in a symphony is the same as a clarinet in a band uniform. And that you're going to see oboes with bags on them, and tubas with so a lot of mitigation on instruments. You might see singers needing to wear masks in order to perform as we start to reopen. I don't think that lasts forever. And they're improving those masks, right? So that they've got the ones that kind of sit out from your face so that you can project a little bit more. I think we'll start to see maybe some new technologies to make all of that sound better and make that a little bit more palatable. I think that sanitation is always going to be a key. Though I think that wiping everything down has obviously become a little less important more recently, as we begin to understand that it's really person to person. Mask wearing is essential. The social distancing is essential. Wiping everything down and having everything sanitized is also nice. Actually, I follow Steve Adelman, who did some of the. He actually was the lead author on the Event Safety Alliance Guide to Reopening, which was like the first one out of the gate, and it's still to this day kind of a gold standard. He's going to be speaking at our Arts Day coming up at the end of March. But that was basically his update, was that nothing has really changed about how we're doing this and how we thought we were going to do it back in May, except that now we're more focused on the masks and the air handlers and less focused on getting everything scrubbed down with alcohol. So I think that's going to have a lot to do with how, and it's going to be every time that governor moves the goalpost, we're going to have to figure out the way to meet it and do our jobs and do our craft. And then the goalpost is going to move again, and we'll have to work with it. But I don't think we're going to get to one glorious day where we're back. It's going to be a lot more innovation.
Do you think that the virtual streams, a lot of theaters all over the country, all over the world. I just watched last weekend the Irish Reps meet me in St. Louis. Do you think that the virtual streams are going to either delay audiences wanting to go back to live venues or hurt the live venues in any way?
I think it's hard to say. I think that we probably are going to live in a world where we can do more of everything online, whether or not that's working or watching theater. That said, I think that honestly, it is the theater junkies that want to sit in front of their computer and watch, right? Right? And like, I know, Lauren, it's you, right? Because you're like,
I don't even like it that much. I mean, when I watch Ratatouille and I go, you know what? It's really not that bad. You know, I'm desperate for theater.
right. I think that once we have a live option, our desire to watch these things on a computer screen is going to be significantly diminished, but I don't think it's ever going to go away. I think that, I'm like, as I was saying, we've got we're doing our Arts Advocacy Day in March, and for the first time, it's going to be digital and trying to figure out all of the ways to do a digital conference because that's the new thing. And how do we meet with legislators in a digital way? And then all of a sudden, I'm like, oh my God, I've got so much work to do between now and March, but then I got to do the whole thing again in 2022. And by then people are going to want to show up, but then some people are still going to want to do the virtual thing. So now I got to do 2 conferences. And so like, we're going to be, and I mean, that's just my problems. And so the theater world, the music world, the museum world, as we move through this, God only knows what we're going to have. I think the digital world and the streaming and the making our collections or whatever available online is going to become part of what we do. I'm hopeful it doesn't become all of what we do, because I think that I'm ready to sit in a theater, right? Like just next to somebody and feel it and hear it and get the goosebumps on the back of my neck, and it just doesn't work the same way in a virtual experience.
It doesn't feel the same way, for sure. And I have been to a couple of post-COVID live events, and Cape Fear Regional Theater had Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill, and they did temperature checks, and there were masks, and it was outside. And really, I felt like they were taking all precautions. So I think as we do get back to reopening, as you and I were talking about earlier, there's going to be a lot of information, public information that has to come through so people do feel more comfortable. Just wear masks so we can go back. Let's go back to ballet. Let's go back to theater. Let's do it.
And I mean, and I was thinking about this earlier today, is that I'm really hating it for the high school theater kids right now, right? Because because I tried, my youngest daughter is a dancer, and I've been trying forever to get her into theater, and she finally is a freshman at Enloe High School, and she's taking theater, and I'm so excited. But I can tell, and I'm sure that her teacher is doing amazing work, but there's just no way that she's going to have that connection the way that I had when I was 14, sitting in front of a computer screen in her room, right? No matter how good the internet connection is, it's just never going to be the same thing. And I think too that we know that production value when you're watching something on a screen matters, right? Because I mean, I have been in face-to-face live theater and 16-year-olds that will just shake me to my core. But on a screen with no production value, and it's not the same. So yeah, you can get a production of Hamilton on Disney Plus, and that's going to have all the bells and whistles, but you're not going to, the democratization of theater isn't happening. And so because not everybody has the cameras and the lights and everything that they need, but that you could do, and as a former lighting designer, I obviously don't want to say you don't need lighting for good theater, but there's plenty of good theater that happens without good lighting, right? It's really about the actor and audience.
No, you need good lighting. Somebody has been with lighting in this room for the last. We need good lighting. Arts North Carolina is such a dynamic organization, such an important organization for our state, for our arts organizations. We've talked about the immediate need for our organizations. Um, Down the road in September, let's assume, once things start reopening, what do you anticipate the needs are going to be?
I think, and part of the conversation that I'm having right now is what is that need, right? Because as we head into the North Carolina the session, they're going to be gaveling in legislators from across the state are going to be in Raleigh in the next few weeks, and they're going to be starting a conversation about a state budget, and we don't really know what that's going to look like because that really depends on how much federal money is going to be continuing to come into the system, and that's going to depend a lot on what's going on in Georgia right now. But
Focus,
right, so
focus.
stay focused. But so we're having that conversation, right? Like, can we talk to the General Assembly about some one-time funding to restart the arts in North Carolina? Because that's going to be the problem, right? So we've kind of sized everything down. We've let people go, put them on furlough, laid them off, shuttered our buildings, right? Like, well, what is it going to take to reopen those buildings? What is it going to take to bring that talent back? Have they gone to a state with different restrictions or lower caseloads, right? Like, have we lost our artists? Have we lost our creative capital? We can't even begin to figure all that out yet. But I think we've got to start having that conversation in a very real way. So part of what Arts North Carolina is looking to do is how do we support that from a policy initiative, both in funding and restrictions with reopening, having a conversation about what other resources are needed, what legal resources. I was just having a conversation about a partnership trying to do some more trainings around what's needed from a legal standpoint in terms of closing down, if that's what you need to do, or reopening, and what are the nuts and bolts of that. And then how do you create a business model that works when maybe you're only getting 80% of your audience? So but that obviously is going to start with us asking for public dollars because that's what we do. And I think we've got a really important case that this is an industry that completely shut down, right? Like you can't get takeout theater, right? Like and that's not to say that the restaurant industry is not struggling, because they are, and we're going to lose a lot of great restaurants, and I feel that we're going to lose a lot of great performing arts organizations. But but trying to move us out of stagnation is going to be a really heavy lift. So I think that we're going to be realizing that in August and September. I hope that we're coming out of stagnation in August and September.
Yes, yes. So what can the public do to, or artists or producers watching this, what can we do to support Arts North Carolina's advocacy efforts?
Okay, well, in case you haven't noticed, I'm a walking or a sitting billboard at the moment. Please come to Arts Day 21, March 22nd through 24th. So we're going to have that conversation with those legislators, right? It's really crucial that they put some faces or some voices and some stories behind all of these numbers. I can give you all the data you need, but they really need to know what's going on in the state. And Arts Day is part of what we do for that. That's really our big event. We're going to be opening registration later this month. It's going to be, you can do the full conference, which is going to have a lot of really great content about reopening and some other issues. Or for $5, you can just do the meetings, right? And we're going to have a lot of the training and materials and resources for free on Facebook as well. So we're trying to get as many people across the state to really step up and take part in the process, because that's going to be so key. Because we've had some major achievements and some wins, but we can't stop, right? We have to continue that conversation. Secondly, I encourage anyone to certainly support your arts organization. If you are an individual, if you are an arts organization, please become a member of Arts North Carolina. The less time that I have to worry about fundraising, the more time I'm worrying about how to get more money out to the arts organization. So And it's based on a sliding scale, right? Like I've had, obviously, a lot of our members have been paying a lot less to Arts North Carolina because their budgets went from 3 million down to 500,000, right? So everybody's budget is shrinking, mine included. But so making sure that we're connected through like my email list or whatever, but also as a collective of organizations, that really helps us to move forward as a unit and have a single voice. But at the very least, get on my email list. Lastly, to help Arts North Carolina, you can get the Creative State license plate, which is a really wonderful way to find your car at Trader Joe's or Walmart or wherever you're doing your shopping. You can go to thecreativestate.org and it'll jump you up there to the DMV. 5 minutes in your credit card. It's $30 a year to have one. $10 the state takes for the nefarious purpose of putting wildflowers on the side of the road, and the other $20 comes to me. And with that, that is how we afford a professional lobbying firm, Ken Mountain and Associates. And so we're having that conversation. So the arts never, so if you might walk away at the end of Arts Day and stop talking to the General Assembly, but we and our lobbyists never do. So that conversation is happening all throughout the year to make sure that we carry it home through the budget process and beyond on policy.
Well, and we've seen the fruits of your hard work and labor over the last 8 or 9 months. And if you've benefited at all from the monies that the General Assembly provided in September, or this new state, Save Our Stages, it's organizations like Arts North Carolina that are pushing that legislation through. So we have to back you up, Nate. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I will let you get back to the television and watch your results. Nate and I were saying before we went on air, we're both news junkies. We would be glued to CNN right now while waiting for results. But thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you at Arts Day, and just everybody keep masking up, keep staying safe, so that we can get back to live theater, live venues, because there's just nothing like it. I miss it. So thank you again, and take care, and don't go to sleep too late tonight. I have a feeling it's going to be a long election night.
Yeah, set the alarm early. It'll still be going on.